Here we go. Hello, everyone. And hello, everyone here. We have a small audience in the room and a slightly bigger audience online. If you guys have any trouble hearing or seeing us, please just put it in the Q&A and we'll see if we can figure out what's going on. My name is Iris and I'm with Fogo Island Arts, for those of you online who don't know me. And if you're not familiar with Fogo Island Arts, it is a founding program of ShoreFast. It was founded in 2008 as a residency program, and since then has grown into a program of exhibitions, public programs, research projects, publications, and more residencies. And tonight we have Leo Cocar giving us a curator's talk. Leo is here as part of, well, he's the recipient of the Hnatyshyn Foundation Young Curator Residency. This year, Tobin is giving a heart. I don't know if you know. So I want to start with saying on Fogo Island, we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost as a result of colonization. We also acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as the ancestral homeland of diverse populations of Indigenous people, including Innu, Inuit, and Mi'kmaq. And to introduce Leo, Leo is a cultural worker from the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. His writing has appeared in Flash, e-flux, Bomb, C Magazine, Momus, among others. He holds a BA from the University of British Columbia and an MA from the Center of Curatorial Studies at Bard. Yeah, Leo will do a presentation, I think about 30 to 45 minutes. We will have some time afterwards for questions. So if you have anything, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get a chance to ask Leo after the talk.
Just want to see if this is working. Cool. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me. Andrew and Kitty for inviting me to this residency. Iris and Alicia for the tireless support behind the scenes, and Sarah for volunteering as my personal aide and driver. Shout outs to my mom and Tobin for being on this presentation. I know. Oh. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. And that's like streaming the thing. Okay, sweet. Should I restart?
No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and shout out to Tobin and my mom for being up at like 6:30 a.m. for this. An additional thank you to Ethan and the entirety of the Fogo Island community for the warm welcome. Having lived functioning exclusively in cities my whole life, this residency has been a necessary break, not only in the sense of being able to breathe fresh air, touch grass, and hear my own thoughts, but the simple idea of knowing thy neighbor has been a needed shift from the all too frequent feeling of atomization baked into urban life. I think that this residency has been a formative and necessary period. As a young curator and writer, I've felt, like almost everyone else with a wage job, that the day simply does not have enough time. As economists have noted, leisure time for workers in the industrially developed world has been in decline since the 1980s, and perhaps more insidiously, leisure itself has been co-opted by language and logic of productivity. My personal favorite version of this assertion is a faulty but fun argument put forth by economist Juliet Shore. That the modern worker has less time off than a medieval peasant at about 170 days of work per year. Hustle culture, the conceptualization of education as being tied to worker potential or marketability on the labor market rather than intellectual growth, and even the hyperbolic exaggeration of our time off on social media, think endless streams of vacation photos, images of chic openings, food photography, etc., are but a few of the many indications of this trend. At this moment in time, it feels that even when off the clock, we must be optimizing and tuning ourselves towards success within the job market, a quality reaffirmed and conceptualized in various ways by thinkers such as Deleuze, Schiapello, and Berardi, among others. I bring this up as a basis for why this residency has been meaningful to me. As an emerging curator, it's not only that my leisure time to reflect, think, and engage is limited by my 9 to 5, but that anything outside of the workday also becomes warped by market and labor pressure. The professionally network-tinged quality of gallery openings, the pressure to constantly attend said openings, and endless job, residency, and exhibition applications eat up what little daylight I have when I'm off the clock. Even the things that I love, writing and curating, are susceptible to this contemporary condition. Gig and contract work constrain the terms of my intellectual production to the needs of hirers and editorial guidelines and board pressure, limit what can be written and how. In the small slice of the day left over in which I pursue projects simply for the sake of fun, I must often check myself to ensure that these for pleasure things that I read, write, or plan are not being instrumentalized towards making myself a more marketable cultural worker. In this light, what this residency is allowed for is the pursuit of various threads of thought, loosely articulated ideas, and concerns that have been left neglected during my everyday life. It has been striking to sit back and realize how many tangentially linked and rhizomatic ideas and interests I've left on the back burner in this aforementioned grind, for varying reasons, and often because they did not neatly fit into an ongoing project, and this residency has been an opportunity to begin to suture them together. As such, this talk will be a provisional linkage of some works of art and pieces of writing I've been interested in and how they link to some ongoing work. They're not cleanly interwoven, but more constellation-like in form. In a way, this presentation will be a reconstruction of my thought process leading up to my planning for my forthcoming exhibition with unceded at the Fall River Museum of Contemporary Art, a reconstruction of a genesis that I lost sight of until my time in Deep Bay over the last 6 or so weeks. In a way, my exhibition with unceded has been a subconscious or organic materialization of many of the ideas and citations I will discuss in this talk and this residency, and this presentation is an act of retracing my steps. The pace of I'll stay on the nice paintings for now. The pace of staying here has certainly been instrumental to this in the way that my time isn't structured around deadlines, but impulses, the day and night cycle. And the only real indicator of what day of the week it is if it's Tuesday night darts at Deep Bay or not. Furthermore, it's the context of Fogo Island Arts and Shorefast itself that has been of interest to me, something I'll touch upon further later on in this talk. In the way that which art making here is treated as both interdisciplinary and socially embedded. This intermedium quality is particularly present within the practices of the Foodways residents, but emerges in more subtle moments, such as the activation of Liam Gillick's weather station by geologist Peter Kroll. Structurally, the act of making work here functions as both an economic driver and mode of communal engagement. In a sense, art making here on Fogo Island is an activity widened in scope by both the way in which the object or practice is treated and how is it exhibited or viewed. This opening up of art, quote, has been one of the draws and sources of inspiration for being here. Okay, now for the art. Okay, back to the conceptual kind of dry stuff. The pace of staying here, the point of departure is the following work. Brazilian conceptual and installation artist Cildo Miralez's insertion into ideological circuits and insertions into ideological circuits too. The work is quite self-evident formally. Coca-Cola bottles and US and Brazilian currency marked with text by the artist. The text is subtle, often faded, and stamped, and due to these qualities, the artist's interventions in these objects can easily go unnoticed. Not only because the presence of text itself is formally minimal, but the stamp, which evokes mechanical processes of producing language, make it so that this text could easily read as something by design, or perhaps a generic mark of usage from a teller or something of the sort. To get really specific, the banknotes were printed on old Cruzeiro notes that were reissued as Novo Cruzeiro in 1967. To simplify this transition between bills, the Bank of Brazil would rubber stamp the old notes as a simple form of reissuing, something that Miralez's gesture here imitates. If one were to look closer, one would recognize that these words are not marks of ownership in the case of the bills or one would recognize that these works are marks of ownership in the case of the bills or sloganeering or ingredients in the case of the Coke bottles, but rather political cries for action in Portuguese and English, with text reading such as Yankee go home, straight elections, referring to the political corruption rampant in 1970s Brazil, and who killed Herzog, gesturing towards a journalist killed under unclear circumstances under police custody, or marking them with instructions on how to turn the bottle into a Molotov cocktail. For a bit of background for those unfamiliar, Miralez, as I mentioned, is a Brazilian conceptual and installation artist. Born in Rio de Janeiro in 1948, his early artistic development occurred against the backdrop of the Brazilian military dictatorship, which ran between 1964 and 1985, which heavily restricted artistic and political freedoms. His work from the 1960s and 1970s reflects a response to this environment, engaging with the limitations of state control and censorship. In this period, Merlis was influenced by the broader international avant-garde movements, especially conceptual art and fluxus, and sought to extend the boundaries of art beyond traditional media. A central theme in Merlis's work is the critique of systems of power and control, especially those related to state mechanisms, consumerism, and capitalist ideology. This is evident in one of his earliest and most famous projects, Camino de Graal, an interactive installation involving a large wooden labyrinth that invited viewers to navigate its spaces, with the implicit suggestion that individuals' movements were controlled or determined by larger political forces. This early piece foreshadowed many of Merlis's later explorations of how societal structures shape perception and behavior. The Insertions series began shortly after in 1970. For much of his career afterwards, he returned to and continued on mobilizing installation, meaning that insertions into ideological circuits was relatively novel in his exploration of systems of control and power. In this way, it was his only inquiry that parasitized or used systems themselves rather than installations that activate space and architecture. In contrast to traditional views of art as a self-contained individualistic pursuit, Merlis consistently foregrounded the social dimensions of art. His work insists that art is not only a medium for aesthetic contemplation, but a tool for generating critical awareness and action within society. Merlis has described his work as aiming to provoke a disruption in the audience's normal perception of reality, forcing them to confront the relationship with power, authority, and systems of meaning. This view aligns his practice with the socially engaged models of art that emerged in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, such as Grupo Frente and the Tropicalia movements, both of which aim to challenge and reframe cultural norms. Returning to insertions into ideological circuits, I want to emphasize its mobility in relationship to circulation and the way it evokes and parasitizes networks of ideology, capital, and information. The artist's statement, which was imprinted on the back of most of these objects, is telling, quote, to register informations and critical opinions on bottles and return them to circulation, end quote. This statement unveils both its conceptual bent and its construction. Within both contexts, the conceptual bent is evident. These small mundane objects, consumer goods and money, circulate ceaselessly without rest, and each one is a concentrated nexus of the above systems, capital, ideology, consumerism, etc. With the US dollar signs and Coke bottles, with the US dollar signs and Coke bottles, US imperialism has added this triad, a key element considering the CIA's involvement in Brazil's 1964 coup that formed the political context of Merlis's practice. The Coke bottle's need for circulation to be activated is underscored by the white ink. Against the backdrop of the soda, it is emphasized, being rendered quasi-visible when the dark liquid is consumed. As such, the visibility of Merlis's mobile graffiti is only replenished when the bottle's refilled after being recycled, pointing to the artist's intent for the work to circulate even after consumption. In the artist's terms, the insertions into ideological circuits arose out of the need to create a system for the circulation and exchange of information that did not depend on any kind of centralized control. This would be a form of language, a system essentially opposed to the media of press, radio, and television, typical examples of media that actually reach an enormous audience, but in the circulation systems of which there's always a degree of control and channeling of the information inserted. The way I conceived it, the insertions would only exist to the extent that they ceased to be the work of just one person. The work only exists to the extent that other people participate in it. What also arises is the need for anonymity. By exception, the question of anonymity involves the question of ownership. When the object of art becomes a practice, it becomes something over which you can have no control or ownership, end quote. This work has returned me to a simple series of interrelated questions that begun, as it has for many others, at the undergraduate level. What is a work of art? What are its boundaries? How do we define it? How do we expand it? Can it even be expanded? I think this line of inquiry will be a source of existential dread familiar to anyone who is seriously engaged with the arts, and indeed forms arguably the fulcrum of art historical inquiry itself. From thinkers interested in the ontological status of the object to those who propose various means of interpreting it. This line of thought has become more complicated for me personally through my time as a graduate student at the Center for Curatorial Studies. Insofar, curatorial discourse is another contentious and additional lens which affects the status of the object itself. This line of thought operates in tandem with an additional question that has occupied various portions of the art world's limelight throughout history and is certainly of major concern now. What is a political work of art? This single work, although certainly not addressing all these questions, has begun to poke at a few of them and in dialogue with one another. It is evidently impossible for me or even this work to address these questions, which are couched in decades or century-long debates, but I think that insertions into ideological circuits touches upon many of them from a number of angles in ways that have inadvertently informed or coincided with my own thought processes values, and projects. Firstly, the nature of the object. What struck me about my first encounter with this work a few years ago when scrolling through the Tate's collection was that it almost seemed to dissipate. Insertions is a strange object considering its almost invisible nature was by design and a necessity needed to escape strict censorship laws in 1970, the height of the dictatorship's authoritarianism. What is curious about this object then is its in-between status. Hewn from the context of the museum and the gallery, its status as an art object is not confirmed by its location within an institution. As opposed to the classical example of Duchamp's urinal, in which a mundane, almost abject object becomes art through its display context, or perhaps a more updated version being Steinbach's work, which calls attention to the ways in which curation, ordering, and collecting confer status upon an art object. Due to this formal anti-aesthetic quality and in the absence of institutional validation, insertions into ideological circuits operates more within the veins of pure communication, language, or political agitation. Its whole purpose is to resist the erratic qualities of the unique work of art, as per Walter Benjamin, through its anonymous, mass-produced quality, and to smoothly enter the world. Of course, its artness is retroactively bestowed upon it simply due to critical discourse surrounding the work and its entry into collections such as the Tate, not to mention their origination as a work by the artist for the Momus 1970 show, Information. Make sure it's nothing important. Okay, never mind. But the fact remains that insertions into ideological circuits was entered into Brazil's consumer circulation. About 1,000 bottles were produced, and an unknown amount of the bills. Two operations here at play. Firstly, this work stipulates that art occurs at the level of relationality or the network. And secondly, that the object becomes particularly interesting when it reaches total escape velocity from the art world. The second aspect is inextricable from the first, insofar the first element, i.e. relationality as the art object, has long been a tried tradition within art practice. Infamously, there's Rickert Tirvania's 1990 work, Pad Thai, in which he served the eponymous dish in the back of Paula Allen Gallery. Subverting the gallery's typical spatial orientation, the exhibition was left blank in the back, where business, trade, and communications take place, became the site of the work. A fitting milieu considering the work's materialization of the idea of relational aesthetics, i.e. practices or works in which the artist does not create relationships between viewers and their objects, but rather sets up events in which the mingling of visitors, i.e. relations, becomes the site of aesthetic experience. Here, the artist served pad thai to gallery guests for the creation of, quote, situations in which he can, quote, conduct an assault on the cultural aesthetics of Western attitudes towards life and living, end quote. Arguably, the Fluxus movement, which Merriles was a contemporary of, was a site of proto-relational aesthetics, and their emphasis on letter art exchange, the collapsing of art into life, events, and communications technology. The concern with communications technology is particularly apparent in the work of Nam June Paik, a Fluxus associate and pioneer of video art who coined the term electronic superhighway to describe the burgeoning world of readily available telecom technology. His practice, in turn, can be seen as another instance in which the concern of artistic practice is focused on circuits of communication. Rather than facilitating relations, his ethos was one of disruption. In this work, an industrial magnet is set upon a 17-inch black and white television. Incoming broadcast signals are then warped by the magnet, transforming them into abstract shapes. In this work, Paik not only questions what kind of images we value, but rather rejects the one-directional quality of TV broadcasting, offering a space for viewer participation capable of aesthetically disrupting the incoming network signal. Indeed, video art is perhaps the privileged space in which a practice can enter itself into networks of circulation in a way which achieves the escape velocity to leave the siloed context of the art world and into the public as a whole. After all, Tirvania's dematerialization of the object took place in a gallery, and Paik's work was a sculpture made for exhibiting. In a sense, through display context, these works are undeniably art. Another example of work that enters public circuitry at escape velocity can be exemplified by Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz's Hole in Space, a public communication sculpture, single-channel documentation from 1980, in which, from November 12th to 14th, 2 life-size screens installed by the artist, one outside a department store in Los Angeles and one outside Lincoln Center in New York City, were connected via a live 2-way transmission. This sudden, unannounced link allowed passerbys in both locations to communicate in real time. Footage of the event shows viewers singing, joking, and speaking to each other as if within the same space, a geographical distance collapsed by a proto-electronic superhighway. This work anticipated technologies like Zoom and the materialization of a networked world, but yet begs the question evoked by insertions in ideological circuits. If an art, quote, object smoothly enters the public sphere of circulation and does not announce its own artness and is more or less identifiable with objects already in the world, what is it? There are many other video works that toe the ambiguous line traced by Rubinovitz and Galloway, particularly those by artists who took advantage of public access television, itself a fascinating history, but not the focus here. What makes Miralez's work compelling to me is the embodiment of the relation and network focused quality of video art that often use Trojan horse or parasitic tactics to enter the world. But what Insertions does is remain true to the material object. I think that this material quality is a point of entry into speculation about what a political work of art can be. As I sort of evoke in the above passages, is that oftentimes art is shown within a siloed context, i.e., it's public, no matter how utopian the artist's intent, is limited to the narrow confines of the art-going public. I think what artists such as Fred Wilson, Hans Hake, Andrea Fraser, Adrian Piper, and many others from the school of, quote, institutional critique have demonstrated, and what many of you here already know, is that institutions are not neutral spaces of experimentation and play, but are rather implicated in a complex ideological system. This image above, coincidentally also from, I believe, the same 1970 exhibition Information at MoMA, which showed insertions into ideological circuits, is a Hake work in which he asked visitors if they would vote for MoMA board member Nelson Rockefeller, who was running for governor at the time, if he refused to denounce Nixon's Vietnam War policy. Rockefeller had previously endorsed this policy in private. Visitors who stated that they would not vote for Rockefeller outnumbered those who would 2-1. It does not require Hake's work to reveal this bias implicit in institutions. The current violence in Palestine is a moment of historical recursion from Hake's context, opening fault lines and tension between institutions and their publics worldwide. To quote Hake, what we have here is a real exchange of capital, financial capital on the part of the sponsors and symbolic capital on the part of the sponsored, end quote. Meaning that art making and exhibiting within an institutional context cannot only be siloed in terms of a limited public, but can be stifled in terms of what can be said when the work of the artist is tied to the ideological bent of the space. This is not to say that I reject the museum writ large, but to merely draw attention to the fact that as a venue for art's existence, it has limits, barriers, and boundaries. In this light, and in dialogue with insertions in ideological circuits, I've been thinking a lot about the theorist Theo Adorno's writings on aesthetics, which composed a significant portion of his oeuvre. I'll save you the agony of citing from his painful and opaque sense of prose and approach in my own words, bar this quote. That artworks as windowless monads represent what they themselves are not, can scarcely be understood except in that their own dynamic, their immanent historicity, as a dialectic of nature and its domination, not only is of the same essence as the dialectic external to them, but resembles it without imitating it. In more simple terms, what this is to say is that the artwork contains a tension. On the one hand, representing something beyond itself, like a painting is not love or nature embodied, but rather an evocation of it, for example. But yet is always constrained by its conditions, socially and politically, that produced it. For Adorno, what the work of art should do is resist its commodification to mere entertainment, but rather act as a mirror that exposes the truth, no matter how painful. The work of art should reveal the contradictions found in society, unveil the obfuscated nature of reality, and invite critical reflection. In a sense, the work of art should use its internal logic as a tool to shine light on the things around it. I'm not going to stand on my soapbox here and espouse Marx, but since Adorno's thought is firmly engaged with the trajectory of Marxism, and insertions into ideological circuits is evidently engaged with this thought through its concern with money and commodities, I'll bring up only one citation. If following the above passages on institutions as limited spaces for art's existence, and if one, like Miralles, were to engage with the political through political economy, i.e. capital, we return to the problem of circuits, or more accurately, movement. Capital is not a stultified thing existing in one place, suffused in the bank or the factory or whatever. As scholar David Harvey stipulated, quote, capital is value in motion, end quote. It moves from production to labor to the commodity form in an endless loop. Capital cannot be pinned down. Contra this, in a sense, the museum is largely immobile and perhaps one node in this chain, and thus constitutes a relatively limited arena for critique if we are to be thinking systematically. I think why insertions into ideological circuits has been so compelling for me is that, in a sense, it is capable of parasitizing and entering the whole circuit with theoretical limits. This relationship is particularly important if we're to abide by a notion of historical materialism, i.e., the ways the organization of labor and the forces of production are the primary movers of cultural and societal development, of which, of course, art is part and parcel of. Mirales's artistic attack on structure rather than form reminds me of Jean-Luc Godard's differentiation between film about politics and political films, the latter being an address of the form, systems, and context in which the film is made, rather than concerning itself exclusively with representation. If we are to use the above thoughts as a basis for thinking about political art, insertions into ideological circuits certainly fits. Following Adorno, it reveals the ideological and political tensions baked in undersung objects like soda bottles and money. Following capital as a system in motion, it operates as an interesting and rare case study in which it can address and attach itself to this flow at a structural level. But the question still remains from the opening sections of this talk. What of its in-betweenness, its subtlety, that makes it almost invisible as an art object? This in-betweenness in insertions in ideological circuits points to its status as not quite an art object, not quite commodity, not quite network, and not quite relation. This leads me to another thinker that has been on my mind for a while, philosopher Reza Negarestani. If Adorno's writings on aesthetics focuses on the socially illuminating aspects of the art object, Negarestani's writings on art focus on its transgressions of domains of thought and category. For Negarestani, whose most succinct writing on aesthetics takes place in his essay Torture Concrete, which focuses on abstraction, the work of Jean-Luc Moulin, what art should do is break out of, quote, local modes of thoughts. And for him, local modes of thoughts are enclosed discourses such as art philosophy, etc., that are kind of, their own thing. For Negarestani, the breakdown of the, quote, local is important insofar it can lead to reconfigurement of all other fields by incorporating their modes and methodologies. First, what must occur, however, is the breakdown of the local in order to open itself up to possibilities otherwise denied to itself. An example I thought of in relationship to this is the modernist ethos of art for art's sake. Evidently, art only concerned with the conditions of its own construction can hit a wall quite quick with what can be done with this medium. In the announcement for this talk, I mentioned a loose mobilization of Negarestani's thought. This holds true here, as his interest in categorical breakdown seems to be focused on work that engages the interstices of mathematics, engineering, and biology, such as his mathematically engaged knotworks, or this work More or Less Bone shown at Sculpture Center, in which he collaborated closely with engineers from Aerospace Valley, which is like France's equivalent of Silicon Valley, with advanced expertise in formal optimization, wherein the form of an object is defined through a process that identifies the best, i.e. most efficient, least wasteful solution given a set of discrete variables. The problem devised by the artist is to produce an optimized form connecting three generic objects: a sphere, an abstract form, a spiral staircase, a constructed form, and a knuckle bone, an organic form. Modeling these conditions in CATIA and other software, Moulin and the engineers introduced further constraints, manipulating the form of this object of juncture to account for set volume, scale, terrestrial gravity, the material properties of fiberglass, and environmental conditions like wind and earthquakes, otherwise an optimized form. However, I think that local breakdown can take place at other levels, like many of the artists mentioned here have done, including Miralles, through the mobilization of art as a way of reconfiguring social contexts, for example. This can take place through the way it circulates, in the case of Miralles, or in the space which it's shown, which I'll touch upon shortly. Another way that can happen is at the level of form or material, which I think Miralles does achieve through the productions of work that seem torn between several categories. I think another is text. Negarestani alludes to a certain structure in Torture Concrete, that an artist should imprint thought into material, and that in turn, material imprints thought on the viewer. I believe text is part of this cycle, or text and language. Negarestani, in his essay, The Human Centipede, A View from the Art World, takes a similar view to mine elucidated in this talk, although far more pessimistic. Namely, that the art world is a trap, and due to its integration in neoliberal capital, artworks in this context are limited in what they can do. For him, text, whether catalog or essay, constitutes a trap of free choice in which endless interpretation of artworks poses a sense of liberation, when in reality it isn't the case. even critique of the economic systems in which the object is embedded into does not offer a way out. If anything, it further valorizes it. I don't take such an extreme view. Maybe I'm being defensive as an art historian, but the inquiry of art at the level of art history is not a capitulation to me. I haven't fully formed why it's not, but I warned you at the beginning that these ideas are beginning to be sutured together. Aside from this, I think that Nagaristani's text neglects certain kinds of writing, like ekphrasis, i.e. poetry generated in response to artworks, which again, in my view, is a purely generative form of intellectual or noetic engagement with art. Again, may be defensive, but I think text and writing is another avenue of breakout or escape velocity for an art object, which can offer real reevaluations of it while offering another way of circulating in the world. This is an extended preamble towards my current projects. It is through moments like this residency that one can really reconstruct the question of how did I get here? The citations will more or less dissipate now as I talk about current work, but I think the above will come back in flashes and moments. The question of what an art object is, what constitutes a political art object, and what has been a major focus of mine and my main driver for coming here is the way in which art circulates, lives, and moves, and what it means to do so in ways that escape the white cube. I'm gonna grab some more water and then I'm gonna talk about current projects. Oh, thanks. So I'll just talk through like some work and like maybe some of the things I've been talking about will like come through while talking about my projects. This is my thesis exhibition, or this is the thesis exhibition I produced in my master's program. It's a solo exhibition of the work of Harry Goldharvey IV, titled "An Anathema Strikes the Flesh of the Laborer." It constituted like a showing of loaned work and a new installation and some semi-recycled works. A version of this door was shown at the New Museum for the New Museum Triennial. He's done various iterations of these works. But what I was kind of interested in with this project was the kind of like cross-category quality of Harry's work, and if like curation can kind of like lean into this like cross-categorical quality, I guess. Harry uses like a lot of found objects from Fall River, which is like a post-industrial town. It was formerly like a textile town in Massachusetts. And his work not only like references the city, like I've read criticism of his work before, and people kind of like immediately pick up the New England like aesthetic of everything. But his work like directly borrows it. So these church doors are taken from somewhere in New Bedford. These little sculptures here are gas-powered worksite heaters, which are now illegal in Massachusetts because they like cause a lot of fires. But they have this kind of interesting historical quality where they've like caused a lot of like really important historical fires in Massachusetts. So he's kind of reusing the material from his hometown. And so I was kind of like, interested in this like cross-genre quality of his work. So on the one hand, I was thinking about his work a lot in light of like Robert Smithson's ideas of non-site. For those of you not familiar, Smithson was a land artist, and he kind of came up with this idea of the non-site, which kind of like stipulates that an artist can make a work that like draws from and abstracts a specific place or landscape, and in so kind of transposes like the actual like space itself, the actual landscape. So I was kind of interested if like Harry's work kind of functioned in that way, and his like again his like direct borrowing of material and forms from Fall River. And I was also kind of interested in like treating material and art objects as historical documents in and of themselves. So this is like a little vitrine of like little like tchotchkes and materials from Harry's collection that are like important to him, that like sometimes literally form the work and sometimes are like kind of aesthetic inspiration. I should have maybe done a detail shot, but there's like a couple like Kewpie molds here. They're like from like an old factory in the early 20th century, and he reuses them constantly, produce these like little like red rubber Kewpie dolls that he puts on his work. So it's kind of interesting, like the idea of like the potential of like an art object or material to be its own historical document. And I was also kind of interested in like a temporal quality in Harry's work. Like obviously they're like art objects, like they're like stilified. But they have this like weirdly kind of like living or fluid quality. So all these red elements on the burners are casting wax. that he molds and applies in real space. It looked insane when we were installing the show because he like had this like half working crock pot that we were like melting wax into, and he was like pouring it all over. And I really had to fight for his right to be able to do that in the space just for fire hazard and damage reasons. But yeah, so it kind of gives these like objects like a living, breathing quality that they're never quite the same. And even though there's like very definite forms, like these little crucifixes, they seem like they're kind of like melting and forming in real time. So I think, yeah, like this project of mine, this work with Harry and like Harry's work in general, I think kind of speaks to some of the interests I was talking about earlier, in which I'm like kind of interested in like just how many different like categories or spaces an art object or practice can like occupy, I guess. Um, And then now I'll talk a little bit about an upcoming project that I'm doing. Yeah, so I'm working with an artist named Daria Kai, who's practicing or was practicing out of Vancouver, but now they're doing their MFA at the Stadelschule. And we're planning on doing a solo exhibition of their work at the Fall River Museum of Contemporary Art, which is actually owned by Harry and his wife. And for just a bit of context about the space, this is from the website, so it's going to read a little strange. But artist Harry Gold Harvey IV and Brittany Ann Harvey grew up native to the South Coast region of Massachusetts. They established their studios in Fall River full-time in 2020 after years working and showing both across the United States and abroad. In October of 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the need for community space was paramount. Both artists felt the need to have their art practice extended beyond the solitude of the studio, and as a result, their individual work gave way to the collaborative social practice that is the Fall River Museum of Contemporary Art, FRMOCA. The nature of FRMOCA from the beginning of its inception was experimental. The initial exhibition location was on the ground floor of an active textile mill, a setting very relevant to the industrial history and still current manufacturing reality of the city. A positive response from the community and youth of the city and region catalyzed the project continue and develop. In October 2023, FRMOCA moved to its permanent location at 44 Troy Street in Fall River. This current space provides the platform for FRMOCA's exhibitions, supplemental programming, and youth engagement, always free and open to the public. FRMOCA connects the global contemporary art world to the working class community of Fall River, MA through exhibitions, educational outreach, and artistic research. FRMOCA views the world of art and society as a crucial social science at the forefront of new ideas. We work to preserve space for the artistic processes and its outputs as a mean of creating discourse in relation to place and the community, as well as gain new insights into pedagogy, ecology, technology, and conflict as they relate to local industrial and lived realities. FRMOCA is a fiscally sponsored nonprofit organization, and they work in collaboration with UMass Dartmouth's early college program and other area schools. FRMOCA welcomes students from various regional schools to FRMOCA for guided tours and educational workshops. Notably, classes from institutions like RISD, UMass Dartmouth, Mass Art, and Durfee High School visited in the past. FRMOCA's directors co-teach a social practice course at New Bedford High School and Durfee High School as part of UMass Dartmouth's Commonwealth Collegiate Academy. The CCA aims to help juniors and seniors earn at least 30 transferable credits over 2 academic years and 1 summer session. FRMOCA is a key component of this course, integrating the museum's social practice and programming into the curriculum. We also provide internship opportunities for credit to local college students, having hosted interns from institutions such as Mass Art and RISD. In spring 2024, we're extending internship opportunities to UMass Dartmouth students to support our new museum location. Yeah, so I suppose like with all this in mind, it's kind of evident, like kind of considering my interest brought up earlier with like circulation and networks and, how do we kind of like operate in what can often be like sort of like a stultified or like ideologically loaded world. And what I really liked about FRMOCA's programming, or what I find really interesting, is that there's this really kind of like slippery line between like the art installations and like social engagement. So in some cases, its role as like an educational space is like more apparent. On the left is Dylan Mitsuno, who runs this like clothing company, like tailoring thing called Deerskinism, and he's been teaching students about like sewing and pattern making, et cetera, in collaboration with Vance Leathers, which operates in Fall River. And funnily, I forget the details, but ASAP from is like part of this somehow. But yeah, so that's like that's a more like educationally geared thing. But on the right is from a group show that brought in like a number of artists from kind of across the United States who were grappling with plants and ecology. So within the space of the museum, there's all these kind of like fine art objects, quote unquote, but they get activated repeatedly by high school students or other students. So it becomes this like, yeah, this kind of like muddied line between the two elements, but they like cleanly inform each other at the same time. Um, I think like FR Mocha's ethos has been really interesting to me. It's like I think like, talking about the art world is like a siloed thing. And I think Fogo does this as well, which is why I was interested in it in the first place. But it really breaks out of that silo by kind of like engaging local communities, which I think really interesting. And me myself coming from a working class background, like people around me can often find art making or art production as kind of like an elitist, sort of strange, snobby thing. And I feel like spaces like Fogo or institutions like Fogo or spaces like FR Mocha um, can really push against that, I guess, and kind of like demonstrate the social quality or potential of a space. But yeah, that's the background on FR Mocha, and then I'll talk a bit about Daria's work. So yeah, Daria's been working for quite a while, and their work like really kind of blurs the boundary between like art practice, labor, cooking, and like the kind of knot between all these things. Um, like I think like a really good example why I opened with them is this garden collective they had called Garden Don't Care in Unit 17, and on their website, it's treated as an art object in and of itself, which I thought was kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, there's this really blurred line within their work. Here's some more stuff from a recent show, Unit 17, called Corked Up. But yeah, this kind of blurred line between things like networks, relationality. Like it's funny like grabbing a drink or like talking to Daria because we both love art, but we functionally just kind of commiserate about like the cooking industry or like working in restaurants or whatever, or like just the joy of like making food. And what I really liked about Daria's work is like that line between like their artwork and like their kind of labor background is extremely muddied in this clean way that doesn't prioritize one or the other. Um, and I was kind of interested in showing their work within an FR Mocha context just because it seems really ripe for a space for kind of social engagement or education or something like this. What I also really like about Daria's work is that it kind of embodies these things I find interesting in art objects when they kind of like are in between things. Often Daria's work is really specific. Like it draws a lot from materials that are really precious to them, that are really specific. So in this work, Queer Dowry, there's blankets and textiles from their family back in Turkey. In other works, such as Corked Up, it kind of acts as like an investigation into like food as a carrier of culture, issues of like cultural erasure and genocide in Turkey, cooking, like matriarchal lines of kind of passing down culture, like relation, and they all become contained in these like really beautiful kind of like polyphonic spaces. Um, and yeah, I think like this kind of like not muddied is a bad word, but this kind of like, yeah, this kind of complex like changing quality in Daria's work is why I wanted to show the work at FR Mocha in the sense that, again, it's ripe for kind of like educational programming, but in and of itself, by itself, it doesn't really draw a distinction between art and the world outside of it. Um, yeah, so that's essentially it. This is like another exhibition. This is with Amna El Noor and Dana Cotta, also at Unit 17. You can kind of see it in the back, but a lathe, this like little box on the left-hand image was like a lathe cut into the wall. And kind of, I guess, like an inversion of Rickert Tirvania's work. The back became the site of production for food, and then guests could come in and then like eat food, like kind of hang out, et cetera, et cetera. This pumpkin dish was so good. I'm thinking about it right now, actually. um, yes, and yeah, I think like I that's why I'm interested in working with Derek at Formoca because I love Unit 17 so much, and I think it is like a great space for community engagement. But I think that just because of the nature of how FRMOC has been planned or its construction, it like really heavily leans into like public engagement first and foremost. And I'm interested to see how Daria's work operates within this context. This is just becoming like me advertising Unit 17. This is like another work that's like it's kind of giving me a bit of nostalgia. This was a fridge that was in the back garden space at Unit 17 where Garden Don't Care took place, but it's filled with like kind of like vegetables and tinctures and all these kinds of things and like these menus from the area and like all this ephemera. And it was installed at the Belkin Gallery at UBC in Vancouver. And visitors were, this is with Vivian Bissett. And yeah, invitees were like invited to participate in the sculpture. So you could take something, you could leave something, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I don't know. I think, again, considering all the things I've been talking about earlier, I really like Daria's work in the way that it's both conceptually kind of blurred and the way that inserts itself into like communities and like other networks of like circulation. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This is the dinner party we had at the Cole House. So I guess that's kind of part of the whole thing. But anyway, that's it.
Yeah. Talk about people in the room.
No pressure. Oh, sweet. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Is there like do I like read a text or something?
Got a big fun on Fogo.
Oh.
Andrew said, I love what you said about escape velocity from the aircraft.
Thank you. Yeah, we can only dream, really. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not like a utopian or anything like that. Like, I do think like again, I'm not going to get on like my ideological soapbox about the whole thing, but it's like I think like a fundamental problem about being in the world is you can't really escape ideology. But I think that there's like glimpses or like moments in which you can sort of escape. So of course, it's not like Fogo operates outside of capital, but I think the way in which it integrates itself like does like the blurring of the lines. Like again, it has the economic aspect, obviously. And I do think it's interesting again when I brought up foodways or the activation of like Liam Gillick's weather station, um, that it offers mode of escape, at least at the level of category. Like it's not just like art for art's sake or art isolated, like art becomes a thing to be like interacted with or activated further. And in and of itself, I think it's an interesting exercise insofar that we begin to like kind of prod and question, like again, those questions like what is an art object, I think begin to arise in the way in which Fogo treats its curating and program making. Pardon me? Mm. Yeah, I would probably stick with my first answer. How might it impact art forms? Well, I mean, like as we've seen with like the historical examples that like I talk about, like those forms, like like the pad thai piece or like even like the video art, like it's those works like concerns with like relationality or sociability. That's already like a mark of like the work being transformed by being cognizant of the way in which it interacts or relates to the world. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the blurring of the line and Fogo Island Arts Surefest and the idea of community center.
Mhm.
And just throw in the white cube. I don't like that, but I'll be honest.
Yeah.
One of the big aspects of, let's say, Fogo Island Arts and Surefest and other places, I'm sure, the one in Fall River,
Mhm.
yeah, rely heavily on, probably rely heavily on government subsidy and government grant.
Totally.
And also personal patronage, you know, that'd be public. But the blurring of the line, I see as in order to run, let's say, Fogo Island Arts, the absolute foundational need is to bring community in.
Totally.
Because the community is what is being supported and not the art. Or that comes secondary or even third or not lower or higher as in but in order to be funded in under this model, the model is community based, as in community social work.
Totally.
And so that blurring of the line has to be there in order for this to happen.
Totally. Yeah.
And the idea of what capital is, as in capitalism or private public philanthropy, that also gets mixed up because at a certain level they're the same.
Totally. Yeah.
So just
No, I totally agree. I feel like that like elucidates on like Andrea's question like a little bit more in this like really nice way. And again, like it's kind of what I said. Like I'm not like a utopian. Like I do have like friends of mine who are like pretty diehard politically, and it's like with a sort of like throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of a thing. But like you know, I don't really necessarily abide by that line of thought. So of course they're like all intertwined, but I don't suggest that we like cease like the production of artwork or anything like that.
Oh no, it's just like it's just that sometimes I find that it's missed in a lot of the talk these talks about the value of Fogo Island Arts. I've been here for a very long time and it's beautiful. And other especially here in Newfoundland, which a lot of the art based centers are community based because of need for funding.
Totally.
And so I'm not doing an either or. I'm just pointing that out.
Yeah, no. I fully agree. Yeah.
That's the economy.
Yeah. And I think like what you're talking about like kind of brings up this important thing where it's like this like community centered thing makes it so that because the central value isn't like, you know, having like a star artist come in or having like a given art object come in, it like it invites community participation, which I think is like quite hard for the most part. Like again, like having lived in New York for the past year or so, like it takes like kind of like stepping out of that kind of context to be like, oh, this is like such like a niche microscopic social world. But here it's like interesting where it's like everyone kind of seems to interface in some way, or at least most people seem to interface with it in some way. If anyone else has a question, let me know. Otherwise, I might go to sleep.
Are you able to tell us anything else about the upcoming exhibition?
Oh, like you mean like formally, like how like it'll look?
Is it still too?
It's pretty early. Actually, no, that is like it'll take me like a few like maybe 3 minutes, but yeah. So I guess it's a part I neglected because I was talking about like Nagarstani's like skepticism about text, but one of the things like again I'm interested in Akai's work is like something that's like socially engaged that somehow like implicates itself into like networks or like relations. And we plan on producing a small book of like maybe like recipes or like poetry or like loose responsive writing as a way of like extending the way in which the exhibition like exists in the world, which I think like most people like that's why you produce like monographs or catalog essays or whatever. But to do that and then lean into different modes of text to further draw out like the multifaceted quality of their work rather than just doing straightforward art historical analysis or whatever, like again poetry and recipes, etc., etc. There's ideas around having Akai come in, if we can get the funding, of having Daria come in and do some cooking stuff, and then try to like kind of create like set up like a plan for programming so that the exhibition can be socially activated and lived when we're not there. And then they're going to show, the intent is to show work that already exists, to build out some new ones, They're thinking about like maybe doing some like pickling or fermenting and then having those as like living sculptures in the work. And then the last one is using is renting and using like stainless steel kitchen equipment as like plinths for the work. But those are the least preliminary ideas we have so far.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Takeaway with you. And will you leave anything behind, you think?
You mean like a moral lesson or like no anything?
Anything.
I think it's just like I've said this to Sarah before. It's like, you know, you go out in like New York and stuff, and like once in a blue moon, you'll like look out from like a balcony or something, you're like, wow, this is like kind of beautiful. But it's like kind of crazy like how often like I have what's it called? Long studio? Bridge studio. You know, Bridge studio to Cole House isn't a long walk, but like walking there and back every day, like I'm like every single time, I'm like, holy shit, like that's so crazy. It happens, and it happens constantly. Or like when you're just driving into Foodland or whatever, I'm like, wow, this looks awesome. So I think like constantly being like drowning in beauty, I'll kind of miss that. And the cod's good. I'll miss the cod, yeah.
Oh, I just said
Oh,
that's good
oh,
answer.
sorry.
Is there anything else online?
No, so I hope our online audience is pleased with any questions in the chat, but it's been pretty silent for the last couple of minutes.
All right.
Sweet.
So I'm assuming no one has any questions.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Leo.
Hope you all support about it.